Yes. Welcome back. We always have not enough time to talk and to let the ideas create sparks of imagination for us. But I'll welcome you back, and we're going to leave the door open for a few minutes so people that are still wandering back in can, and then I will shut it. And welcome back to those of you who are on the live stream, too. I am very happy to introduce someone who I have had the chance to work with as an education technology consultant, and someone who has done something incredible in combining the cultures of two seminaries into United Lutheran Seminary. And that is something I have great respect for, in a way that honors the history of both Philadelphia and Gettysburg, and has created a seminary that really represents the Lutheran Church, the ELCA branch of the Lutheran Church, and its strengths in the 21st century. I welcome Guy Erwin.
Thank you. Thank you, Pastor Stacy. It's wonderful to be here. Like my colleague and friend Dean Markham, I'm grateful to be in this historic place for the first time. It is quite remarkable, and I rejoice in it. I'm really looking forward to seeing Hebrew and Lutheran on Sunday, too. That's going to be wonderful. I'm a historian by training. That's my major emphasis, so this presentation will be very much historical, but not as specifically about Germanna as some of you might want, because many of you know more about than I do. And I want to focus instead on what the particular situation of German-speaking Protestants, and Lutherans in particular, was in that time and in these places, and why exactly the issues that Dean Markham brought up about establishment and authority and power were different for the German-speaking Reformed and Lutherans than they were for Anglicans or Baptists on either side. And so I'm calling this Caught in the Middle. I apologize for not having the slides as a handout. I was working a little bit on this still this morning, so I wasn't as far ahead as I like to be. But my slides are almost all just pictures. So I'll see that there's some way for you to get them after the fact, but there's not a lot to take notes on, so don't worry about that. What I do want to say at the very outset is how important it is to understand that when the German migrants came to the British colonies of North America, they brought with them all the expectations of church from their homelands, and then they were also transplants in a new place that was not like what they'd had at home, and they had to adapt to being on what in many ways was a frontier. Of course, it was physically a frontier, but it was also for them an entirely new world of expectations. Now, the social class issues and structures and such that pertained to the life of Anglican Protestants here in Virginia were very recognizable to Reformed and Lutheran Germans from the homeland. But when they came here, they did not bring that with them. They actually found themselves low on a pyramid of authority in a place where the people in charge were not like them, didn't speak their language, did not take for granted the same church customs that they did. And that's part of the issue, but sometimes it was an advantage because they could fly under the radar of the established English-speaking church and not participate. Not every fight was one they had to fight. And for many Lutherans, even the revolution itself was a fight they were not sure they wanted to fight. This was something that English-speaking people could deal with themselves. So there is a lot of variety among the way Lutherans felt about these things. Another important kind of upfront definition is that when German-speaking Protestants came from Germany to the New World, of course, sometimes they were invited in groups specifically to do a particular thing, as in Germanna. Sometimes they came by a broader advertising, in the case of the people William Penn recruited to settle in Pennsylvania. But they did not come as a dominant culture. They came as immigrants in a culture in which they were always a minority, even though in some places, like Pennsylvania, they were a very, very large minority and very influential. And they didn't come as just one thing. We don't have perfect statistics on the migration of Germans to America in the 17th and the beginning of the 18th centuries, but some historians have estimated that of the Germans who came, about a third, maybe more than a third, were Lutherans. About a third, maybe less than a third, were Reformed, that is to say Calvinists. And the rest, the remaining third, were radical Protestants of different kinds, Anabaptists, what we think of today as the Amish, the Mennonites, the Schwenkfelders, kind of marginal groups that weren't comfortable even in German-speaking Protestantism, and were not approved of either by Lutherans or by Reformed, and who came to the New World to find an entirely new thing, to start something over that was putting the old country and its oppressions behind. And that was one of the reasons that Pennsylvania was so appealing to them, because from the very outset, it was advertised as a place where all faiths could be tolerated. Now that's a really important distinction between Pennsylvania and Virginia, and I'm the Pennsylvania interloper at this gathering, but keep in mind that the German community communicated within itself across the borders of the colonies. So the German Lutherans of Virginia probably knew more about what was happening among the German Lutherans and Reformed in Pennsylvania than they really understood what was happening among English-speaking people right here in Virginia. So there are cross-sections, intersections between the communities that are important to remember. They were always a minority, and though they were in some ways disempowered, the separation between the English-speaking and German-speaking cultures often gave the Germans more autonomy to do their own thing in their own way and to be their own thing. And as I say, they often communicated both by letter and also through newspapers and other things more intensely with the German-speaking people of Pennsylvania than they did perhaps with their English-speaking Virginia neighbors. Penn's idea of tolerance for all the faiths was not natural to Lutherans or the Reformed. It wasn't practiced in Europe. That previous slide, which you really can't make out the detail. But the point is, this is the western part of the Holy Roman Empire, and it starts with Switzerland in the bottom, and the Rhine goes up through the middle and goes out through Holland at the top left. And you can see it's a patchwork quilt of little countries. All the orange ones were Protestant. The blue areas were Catholic. But among the Protestant ones, and you might be able to sort of see, there are two shades of orange. The lighter orange, which is stronger in the north and the east and goes off the map, is Lutheran. The darker orange, which really you can see Switzerland and the Netherlands at the top, and then a sprinkling of states basically along the Rhine River, were the Reformed, were the Calvinist. In no place in this map were the two churches side by side. Every territory was one or the other. And if you were not comfortable being in that church that was the established church of the place, you were encouraged to emigrate to some place that was like yours. And this was the pattern that was established at the end of the 30 Years' War in 1648. And you could put a religious map of Germany up today, which showed the proportion between Protestants and Catholics, and would be almost the same, that the population was stable from that point onward. But of course they get to America, particularly where they get to Pennsylvania, and no one is privileged. Everyone has to be together, and they have to figure out a new way to live. This idea that William Penn presents was really popular, and he knew it. He knew it would be. So he advertised all up and down the Rhine, because that area in particular was one in which people and ideas traveled more frequently and more smoothly than anywhere else in Germany. We think of rivers today as obstacles, places you need a bridge to cross, but in that era they were actually transportation highways. And so the river itself, from Calvinist Switzerland to Calvinist Holland, was the area in which disagreement with the established Lutheranism of the north of Germany was possible, both for Calvinists and for what were essentially dissenters in Germany, who were the Anabaptists, who really no one tolerated, and needed a place to go for refuge. So Pennsylvania was appealing to all kinds of people for all kinds of different reasons, partly because they couldn't bring their patterns of religious authority with them. They had to keep them to themselves in the new country. There's a lot of romanticism around the migration of Germans to Pennsylvania at the end of the 17th century, the settlement of Germantown, all those things. I mean, it's very true. One thing that's very interesting to me is that in addition to the tolerance that each of the religious groups was going to experience in the new homeland, they also were set free from the expectations of the home country. So it is remarkable how many people crossed the boundaries, how many Germans got to Pennsylvania as Lutherans and ended up Mennonites, or that there was some going back and forth. There was intermarriage, because for one thing, the German-speaking community had to stick together in some ways in spite of its religious differences. One of the reasons I think that the more radical Protestants were so ardent in their enforcement of boundaries and membership within their closed communities, something that some of them still practice, was because of the presence of all these other groups around them who were essentially threatening to lure their young generation away into something else. They had to double down on being their own thing. This was not so much the case for Lutherans and Reformed, but it really was the case for the radicals. So you could, it's hard to see this, and you don't really need to know, but in the 20th century sociological typology of churches, we often speak of state churches. The Anglican Church in this area is the state church par excellence. It was the established church with the right to tax and all of that. But in Germany, the Lutherans and Calvinists were also state churches in their own territories. And so they brought some of those expectations with them, but just without the power. And in some ways, all the descendants of the magisterial Reformation, including later Presbyterians and Congregationalists, are heirs of that idea that there is one church and everyone ought to belong. It's these radicals, the Anabaptists, the Schwenkfelders, later the Moravians, and then of course the Baptists and much later the Methodists. They come from a different assumption about how the church works and how it comes together. It comes together from the community on up rather than from the government down. Many of you are familiar with the famous Muhlenberg family of Pennsylvania, and one could give many lectures on them alone, but I just wanted to lift up because they actually, as a family, represent the range of kind of German Lutheran culture along the eastern seaboard. Henry Melchior Muhlenberg, the father, the patriarch of American Lutheranism, came from the church in Saxony, from Halle, in part to organize the foundering and confused and chaotic situation of Lutherans in Pennsylvania in particular, where they were the most numerous, and to kind of bring some order to the church. He came with the authority of the English crown, or the British crown, because his commission and call came from the Lutheran court preacher at the court of George III. It's one of those anomalies and ironies that George III, the king of Great Britain and Ireland, was also at the same time the Duke and Prince Elector of Hanover. So he was the head of the Church of England and the head of the Lutheran Church in Hanover at the same time, embodied in a single person. So somebody like Henry Melchior Muhlenberg had two kings in one. He had his call to work in Pennsylvania from the English court, but because, and there was a German church and church office in London, because the king was also the ruler of the church in Hanover. And since he was a Hanoverian by birth as well, he really did have two monarchs at the same time. So it's natural that he, and also all Lutherans of his time, who were catechized to believe that the commandment to honor one's father and mother meant, ultimately, that one should honor and obey one's monarch. And even the interpretation of the petition of the Lord's Prayer that asks God for our daily bread was a way of asking for good government, asking to have a benign ruler who would support us in our lives. This was sort of core Lutheran teaching for young people in that era, and it's not that much different for Calvinists, although the Calvinist tradition, even in Germany, had a slightly greater willingness to promote the idea that kings could be tyrannical and would then need to be resisted. Lutherans didn't develop quite as much of that as they could have, which had some momentous consequences in the development of Lutheran theology in the centuries afterwards. But the Muhlenbergs, especially Henry Muhlenberg's two sons, two most famous children, Peter Muhlenberg, Peter Gabriel Muhlenberg, and Frederick Augustus Muhlenberg, on the right and the left of him in this picture, represent the fact that this family also had an incredible reach. Frederick Augustus was a pastor in New York, and Peter, of course, famously became a pastor here in Virginia. And so the three of them, who were in constant communication with one another, often disagreeing about things, really represented the fact that there was a unity among German-speaking people along the seaboard that kind of transcends their relationship with the local peoples. And Peter Muhlenberg's own story, and there are many, again, who probably know more about this than I do, of being kind of in between Episcopalian and Lutheran, getting Episcopal ordination, but serving in places where they wanted a Lutheran, is partly because of his language ability. He could preach in German. There weren't any Anglican priests who could preach in German who were not originally German. So that he also crosses this boundary in an interesting way, a boundary that ultimately becomes less and less important, and after the Declaration of Religious Liberty is one that goes away. The disestablishment of the Anglican Church means that everyone here ends up on the same level, the way they'd been back in Pennsylvania. Anyway, I had a picture just so you can see it of King George, at the same time the head of the Lutheran Church and the head of the Anglican Church. And his contemporary and counterpart, Frederick II, the King of Prussia, whose name is immortalized in eastern Pennsylvania with an enormous shopping mall, who was the monarch who sponsored, with his predecessors, sponsored the institutions in Halle that essentially trained ministers for Pennsylvania over several generations. So in a way, he's the sponsor of that, although it was a neighboring and different province. He's also a representative of the Enlightenment tense cooperation between Lutherans and Calvinists, because Frederick and his family, the monarchs of Prussia, were actually, as a family, Calvinists, but they ruled Lutheran territory. And so they were careful to establish firewalls between their royal authority and the way the church was run, so that their Lutheran subjects would not object to them. It was part of the social contract that went along with the compromises at the end of the 30 Years' War. I don't have too much time, so I won't go into it as deeply as I might have liked, but I think that there's something that I can say to you that most people wouldn't, and that is that I believe that some of the challenge between Lutherans on the one side and Calvinists on the other, but increasingly also between the German-speaking people and the English-speaking people, was on these questions of where authority comes from. The revolution, of course, throws all the monarchical assumptions up in the air and does away with a lot of the clear sense of power and derived power that comes from the crown. But underneath that are some assumptions about what humans are and how humans should be. And one of them is that in the pre-modern era, people assumed that the ordered structure of society was one of God's gifts to humankind. And the fact that there actually was a system, that there was an idea of justice, that there was an idea of authority, was something that people should be happy for and grateful to God for, even if that included monarchs who could be unpredictable and erratic and occasionally tyrannical. That somehow God had this, in God's great providence, had all this in hand in a meaningful way, and that it was something that humans needed, that the idea of obedience to a superior, whether it is a parent, a pastor, a monarch, that was somehow innate in what it means to be human, and that people were more comfortable when they felt a part of that. I think there's some psychological truth in that even today. We all have fellow citizens who would rather be told what they should believe than want to find it out for themselves. But what they come up against in the late 17th and early 18th century is a counter way of thinking about what it means to be human, what it means to understand reality, that starts from the human out and believes that what we perceive through our senses and to know from our experience is what should determine our understanding of everything that is real. So if you wanted to take this to the level of a philosophy class, You would say it would be the challenge of the difference between Leibniz, who was the ruling philosopher of Germany, who was still caught in ideas of innateness that long precede him, and John Locke, who is on the other extreme, believes that nothing has any validity unless we can experience it through our senses and talk it through as rational beings. In a sense, they're both wrong, because there is more to it than that. We are hardwired. At the same time, we are capable of learning. And the truth is somewhere in between. But at the time, they really represented hard options. And in some ways, the Leibnizian one is one that supports submission to authority. The Lockean one, as we know, because of his influence on the revolutionary generation in America, is one that promotes personal autonomy. And so in some ways, these questions go back to that. The Germans were one way, and the English-speaking people were another. So at the end, I would say, what I would like you to carry away from this is a recognition that Lutherans, and to a lesser degree the Reformed, were state church people in America who didn't have a state church. They came with the assumptions of how that should work, but it didn't work for them. They still had to pay the tobacco tithe to the Anglicans and then raise money to build their own church. So they were not happy about that, but there's a degree to which church people are never going to be happy anyway. But you want the bishop until they offer you one, and then you don't want one. So anyway, and they were this strong linguistic and cultural minority in a place where their language was never dominant and where religion for them was associated with language. And they then find themselves, even Muhlenberg had trouble with this, catechized to obedience suddenly in a world where the people were going to be the sovereign. That's really hard to get your mind around. And because they're Germans and practical, they focused more on social welfare than on convincing other people that their theology was correct. And as a consequence, they were not equipped to take part in public debate in the same way that English-speaking Calvinists were. And one should point out that in the 18th century, there was a very strong Calvinistic strain, even in the Episcopal Church, and that in fact the theology taught from most Anglican pulpits in America in that time was very highly colored by Calvinism. Thanks.
Thank you. Do we have questions? Speak right into this.
This is an easy question to answer. I know we're never going to get into all the depth of things that we all want to know in this room. Is there going to be a bibliography available of sources that the speakers are speaking to today? That
I'm sure that somehow we could manage that. I
was going to say, it may take us a little while, but that's a great idea.
Yeah.
So, okay.
These will be available at some point.
They'll be available this afternoon for you
I've
to
got
take
them
with
ready.
you. I just
Right.
have to get them over on the copier. I'm going to go here, and then I'll come back.
I was the one who posed the question about the Anglican Church earlier. Do you have a response?
Repeat the question.
How is it that the Anglican Church?
Do that before lunch.
Okay.
Yes.
You said next speaker. I still want to know, but I do have another question though, is because if I understand this correctly, and please tell me if I'm wrong, the majority of the people, in my understanding, from our homeland in Siegerland were Calvinists.
Yes, they were Reformed.
Okay.
That was a Calvinist territory.
So does that mean it would have been easier for a Calvinist German to relate to a Scottish Presbyterian? Because I never understood how my grandparents got together.
Well, at some point, you're right. But after the first, it would take a generation or two before people literally spoke the same language. And when they could speak the same language, German Reformed and Scottish Presbyterians would discover they share the same theology, essentially. And this is why Lutherans always felt uncomfortable and felt like they needed to have some other place to worship, some other way to be together and to keep their faith alive apart from the Reformed. So they weren't the same.
My question doesn't have a whole lot to do with religion, but you look like the person who could answer it. I cannot tell you the number of times Germans and some Americans have said to me, you know, German almost became the official language of America. Can you please dispel that and
Yes, that's
explain
sort of
how?
fake news, as people would say today. Although those who were anxious in one way or another about the new American Republic not being perfectly united in language sometimes used the presence of this very strong, vocal, and highly literate German population as a way to whip up anxiety about America not being univocal in that way. And I will just name some names and say Benjamin Franklin is one of the great offenders in that. It sounds like he's trying to flatter the Germans, but in fact he was denigrating them a bit. But he was also capable of saying they're the ones who actually have the productive farms, they're the ones who bring us industry, they're the ones who create new things among us. So it goes both ways.
I am going to ask a question that will probably cause you to speculate. Do you think that that is the presence of literate Germans and the larger number of them is one reason that we did not have an official language from the beginning? We still don't today?
Yeah, I don't know whether I would say that.
Okay.
Yeah, it's possible, but I think even Germans understood that to be part of a country in which everyone gets the system in the same way, at least some basic knowledge of English was necessary. I mean, the Pennsylvania Germans have done a remarkable job of keeping the language alive even today. It's astonishing to me. But everyone speaks English.
I'm going to take these. We have 3 questions in the air. We'll take those last 3.
What would you define as the primary theological differences between the Lutherans and the Calvinists, especially in those early days?
Right. Let me see if I can put that in maybe 2 sentences, which would not be very fair to either tradition. But Lutherans have, at their best, been allergic about making assumptions about God the Almighty and God's abstract divinity, and have preferred to focus instead on the way God reveals God's self to humankind through Jesus, and have focused much more intensely on both the person and the theological work of Christ than Calvin did. I mean, Calvin believed all the same things that Lutherans do, but added on an idea that God is somehow intelligible to us, and that we can see from the world around us and from our own inner gifts given by God, we can see God clearly. And Luther and most Lutherans would say, we cannot ever see God except through Jesus. So it's a difference in emphasis.
Amen. Hi, thank you so much for what you've taught us today. We just spent 4 days in Pennsylvania. Thank you. Wondering
On
about
behalf of Pennsylvania, you were very welcome.
wondering about the origins of the Moravian Church. We were just in an area where Moravians have a headquarters. And then also the origins of the Pennsylvania Dutch, the Amish, and the Mennonite. We have lots of them in Virginia.
Yeah. Well, first, the Pennsylvania Dutch are simply German-speaking people of Pennsylvania. Yeah, so they do represent all those 3 faiths. Lutherans and Calvinists would be, from the standpoint of the Amish and the Mennonites, they were the church people because they had churches. They were fancy. They were often also called English, even though they spoke German, because they lived the life of English North Americans. They weren't separate. And of course, it isn't just the Mennonites and the Amish who use Pennsylvania Dutch, but they are the ones who keep it most alive now because it's died out in other places. When my seminary was founded in 1826, one of the reasons we needed a seminary was that after having been in America for so many generations, the young men who were coming to study could neither speak English nor German well enough to preach in it. And so they needed to be brought up to the level of preaching in both languages, because it was expected pretty much until the end of the 19th century that any Lutheran pastor be able to preach in German. Unless, of course, they were Swedish or Norwegian. wisely.
Dr. Guy, one of the titles that you carry is Chair of the Ministerium of Pennsylvania. And I know in reading history of Hebron, there's been a love-hate relationship way back in the early days with the ministeriums. What's that mean that you're chair of the ministerium?
Well, before we had denominations as we have them today, the Lutherans organized themselves regionally, and the Ministerium of Pennsylvania was the group of clergy and congregations from mostly eastern Pennsylvania, the populous part back in those days, who Muhlenberg had gathered around himself to become a church together. Not just disparate congregations, but actually a unit. It was never very perfect. It was rough. And one of the fun things about it is we have volumes of minutes of contentious meetings where they argued about what it meant to be a ministerium. A ministerium is simply a group of clergy, like a presbytery for the Presbyterians, who can guide the work of the church in a wider way than just congregations. Each of them had a president, who would elect a president, usually for only a year at a time because they hated having people in authority and they wanted to turn them over all the time. And that person would be effectively the equivalent of a bishop, would carry out the ordinations and that kind of thing. So this isn't the way it would have been done in Germany, but that's because they had state church systems there, and we didn't have them here. But the Ministerium of Pennsylvania its successor today are two synods of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, the Northeastern Pennsylvania Synod and the Southeastern Pennsylvania Synod. Yes, actually it included New Jersey and part of New York as well. I mean, it was a bigger conception than just our modern synods today. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I am going to suggest that we just pause, and as quickly as we can hook Dan up, that we move directly into Dan's presentation.